You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Where'd you go to school? JD Vance raked over the coals after stupid Nixon comment, based on an article by Tom Bogany. Rebranding power as victimhood. The trick. Vice President JD Vance stood at the Richard Nixon Library and tried to sell a familiar con that the institutions Nixon weaponized were actually the shadow force that destroyed him. On MS Now, Joe Scarborough called the claim ahistoric and stupid, and he was right on the substance if not the theater. Vance, while promoting his book, Communion, was not offering analysis. He was laundering a political grievance into a historical theory. Who had power? The answer in this story is not subtle. Nixon had power. The FBI, the CIA, and Washington insiders were not some neutral audience in the abstract, but institutions operating inside a presidency that had already turned the machinery of government into an instrument of its own survival. That is the uncomfortable fact Vance's framing scrubs away. He wants the public to see elite sabotage. The source points to something closer to elite self-destruction. The blame shift. This is where the misdirection matters. Vance casts Nixon as the victim of the deep state, and attached Trump to the same script, as if any scrutiny of executive abuse is proof of a conspiratorial bureaucracy. That move does one job very well. It relocates blame from decision-makers to the systems that expose them. It turns accountability into persecution and corruption into martyrdom. Scarborough's objection cut through the fog because it named the mechanism. Nixon's use of the FBI, CIA, and insider networks was not a case of the state resisting itself. It was the state being bent toward presidential damage control until the bending snapped. Calling that a deep state takedown is not just wrong. It is an attempt to rename abuse so that future abuse sounds patriotic. The historical launderer, the Nixon Library, is the perfect stage for this kind of fraud. It lets modern Republicans borrow the prestige of a disgraced president while pretending his downfall was a warning about institutional overreach rather than a consequence of what he did with power. That is the whole rhetorical operation. Strip the scandal of agency, keep the grievance, and sell the audience a clean villain. Vance's line about the same institutions trying to do to Trump what they did to Nixon is doing far more work than it admits. It implies symmetry where the source supplies none. It flattens the distinction between scrutiny and sabotage, between corruption and exposure, between accountability and conspiracy. That flattening is the point, the pattern. This story is not really about Nixon, and it is barely about Scarborough's on-air rage. It is about a right-wing political culture that treats institutional consequence as illegitimate whenever the consequence lands on its own people. Every scandal becomes proof of persecution. Every investigation becomes evidence of a plot. Every guardrail becomes the enemy. That is how authoritarian politics learns to speak in the language of grievance. It does not defend power honestly. It recasts power as prey. The result is a political style that demands immunity while accusing everyone else of conspiracy, then calls that inversion history. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Raw Story for today's article with the automated voice of John. Thanks for listening.